The mud sucked at the wagon wheels like a living thing, and Victoria Harrington knew with absolute certainty that her careful plans were about to come undone in the worst possible way. The spring rains had turned the road outside Casa Grande, Arizona, into a treacherous swamp, and her borrowed wagon, overloaded with everything she owned in this world, tilted dangerously to one side as the left rear wheel sank deeper into the mire. It was April of 1878, and Victoria had been traveling for 3 weeks from St. Louis to reach her aunt's boarding house, only to find herself stuck mere miles from her destination, with the sun already dipping toward the horizon. "No, no, no," she whispered, clutching the reins tighter as if sheer determination could keep the wagon upright. The horse whinnied nervously, its hooves struggling for purchase in the slick mud. Victoria tried to guide it forward, but the wagon lurched sickeningly, and suddenly the world tilted sideways. The crack of splintering wood echoed across the empty landscape as the wagon tipped completely over, spilling Victoria and all her belongings into the cold, thick mud. She hit the ground hard, the air knocked from her lungs, her skirts immediately soaking up the muddy water like a sponge. For a moment, she could only lie there, stunned and gasping, watching her few precious possessions scatter across the road. Her mother's china teapot rolled past her face, miraculously unbroken. A trunk burst open, sending dresses and undergarments floating in the muddy pools. Books, letters, the silver hairbrush that had been her grandmother's, all of it ruined or rapidly disappearing into the muck. Victoria tried to push herself up, but her hand slipped in the mud and she fell again, this time face first into the cold slime. Panic began to claw at her chest. The horse was still hitched to the overturned wagon, thrashing and terrified. If it bolted, it could drag the whole mess right over her. "Easy, girl," she called out, but her voice came out weak and shaky. She managed to get to her knees, her heavy skirts weighing her down like an anchor. That was when she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching fast. Victoria looked up, mud dripping from her hair and face, and saw a rider coming hard down the road. He sat tall in the saddle, his hat pulled low against the late afternoon sun, and even in her distressed state, she noticed the confident way he handled his horse, guiding it expertly around the worst of the mud. He pulled up short when he saw the overturned wagon, swinging down from his saddle before his horse had fully stopped. Victoria found herself looking up at a man who appeared to be in his mid-20s with sun-bronzed skin, dark hair that curled slightly at his collar, and eyes the color of creek water in summer. His jaw was shadowed with several days of stubble, and dust covered his worn clothes, but there was something in his face that made her heart, already racing from the accident, skip an extra beat. "Madam," he said, his voice deep and steady as he splashed through the mud toward her. "Are you hurt?" "I do not think so," Victoria managed, though she was not entirely certain. Everything ached, and she could not seem to stop shaking. He reached her in 3 long strides and held out his hand. Victoria hesitated only a moment before placing her muddy hand in his. His grip was strong and warm, and he pulled her up out of the mud with surprising gentleness, steadying her when she swayed on her feet. "Let me get you clear of this mess," he said, and before Victoria could protest, he had scooped her up into his arms as easily as if she weighed nothing at all. He carried her to higher, drier ground, away from the struggling horse and the wreckage of her wagon, setting her down carefully on a flat rock. "Thank you," Victoria said, acutely aware that she was covered head to toe in mud, that her hair had come completely loose from its pins, and that she probably looked like some kind of swamp creature. "My horse, is she all right?" "I will check on her," the cowboy said. "You stay put." Victoria watched as he moved to the frightened animal, speaking in low, soothing tones that she could not quite make out. His hands were gentle but sure as he checked the harness, and within minutes he had the horse free from the overturned wagon and calmed. He led the mare to where Victoria sat, then tied both horses to a sturdy mesquite bush before returning to survey the damage. The wagon was clearly beyond immediate repair. One wheel was completely shattered, and the axle looked bent. Victoria's belongings were scattered across 50 feet of muddy road, many already half buried in the muck. "I am sorry," Victoria said, and to her horror, she felt tears starting to blur her vision. "I know you were just passing through. I have no right to impose on your time." The cowboy turned to look at her, and his expression softened. "Madam, you are not imposing. This is not a safe place to be stranded, especially with night coming on. My name is Samuel Quinn. I work at the Double Bar Ranch about 5 miles south of here. Victoria Harrington, she said, wiping futilely at her mud-streaked face. I was trying to reach Casa Grande. My aunt runs a boarding house there. Mrs. Martha Harrington? Samuel asked, surprise clear in his voice. You know her? Everyone knows Mrs. Harrington. She is a good woman. He looked back at the wreckage, then up at the darkening sky. We need to get you out of this weather. Storm is coming in, and these spring storms can be fierce. Casa Grande is another 6 miles up this road, but the Double Bar is closer. My boss and his wife would be happy to put you up for the night while we sort out what to do about your wagon. Victoria knew she had little choice, but the thought of imposing on strangers, looking like she did, made her want to sink into the mud and disappear. Still, Samuel was right. She could already see dark clouds gathering on the horizon, and the temperature was dropping. If you are certain it would not be an imposition, she said quietly. No imposition at all, Samuel assured her. He began gathering her scattered belongings, working quickly but carefully, treating her things with respect even though they were covered in mud. Victoria tried to help, but she found her legs were shakier than she had realized, and her sodden skirts made movement difficult. Samuel noticed her struggling and said, Please, Miss Harrington, rest a moment. You took a hard fall. She wanted to argue, but dizziness washed over her, and she sat back down on the rock. She watched as he salvaged what he could, piling her trunks and bags into a relatively dry spot. When he opened one trunk, he pulled out a cloak that had been protected by layers of other clothes. He brought it to her, draping it around her shoulders, despite the fact that it would only get muddy too. You are shivering, he said simply. The warmth of the cloak and the kindness in his eyes made Victoria's throat tighten. Thank you, she whispered. You are very kind, Mr. Quinn. Samuel, he corrected gently, and it is nothing more than any decent person would do. But Victoria knew that was not true. She had met plenty of people on her journey west who would have ridden right past, not wanting to be bothered with someone else's trouble. The fact that this cowboy had stopped was helping her. Treating her with such consideration despite her bedraggled state spoke volumes about his character. The first drops of rain began to fall as Samuel finished loading what he could onto his horse. It was a strong animal, bigger than Victoria's mare, and it bore the extra weight without complaint. Samuel looked at the remaining items, clearly doing calculations in his head. I will have to come back tomorrow with a wagon to get the rest, he said. But I am going to drag your wagon off the road, so it does not cause an accident in the dark. Then we need to ride. Victoria nodded, watching as he used his rope and his horse's strength to haul her overturned wagon to the side of the road. The rain was coming harder now, cold and stinging against her skin. When Samuel returned, he looked at her mare, then at Victoria. Your horse is exhausted and spooked. I am going to pony her along. You will ride with me if that is acceptable. The thought of being so close to this stranger should have frightened her, but somehow it did not. Maybe it was shock, or maybe it was something in Samuel's steady, honest gaze, but Victoria found herself nodding. He helped her to her feet, and this time when he lifted her, it was to settle her onto his horse's back. The saddle was warm from his body, and she caught the scent of leather, horse, and something else, something clean and masculine that made her blush despite everything. Samuel swung up behind her, his arms coming around her to hold the reins. Hold on, he said quietly, and Victoria gripped the saddle horn as he urged the horse into a careful walk, leading her mare behind them. The ride to the Double Bar Ranch took nearly an hour in the rain and growing darkness. Victoria was acutely aware of Samuel's solid presence behind her, the way his arms bracketed her protectively, how his chest provided a windbreak against the worst of the weather. Several times when she swayed with exhaustion, his arm tightened around her waist, keeping her upright. Almost there, he murmured once, his breath warm against her ear, and Victoria felt something flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with fear or cold. When they finally rode into the ranch yard, Victoria could see lights glowing in the windows of a large adobe house. Dogs began barking, and a door flew open, spilling golden light across the muddy ground. Sam, that you? A woman's voice called out. Yes, Mrs. Thornton, Samuel called back. I have someone who needs help. Within moments, they were surrounded by people. A kind-faced woman in her 40s rushed out despite the rain, taking one look at Victoria's condition and immediately springing into action. Her husband, a tall man with graying hair, helped Samuel get Victoria down from the horse. Good Lord, you poor dear, Mrs. Thornton said, ushering Victoria toward the house. "Come inside, quickly now. Sam, you did right bringing her here." "Her wagon overturned in the mud about 5 miles up the road," Samuel explained, following with an armload of Victoria's belongings. "She is Martha Harrington's niece." "Martha's niece!" Mrs. Thornton exclaimed. "Oh, she will be worried sick. Henry, someone needs to ride into town and let Martha know her niece is safe." "I will go," Samuel offered immediately. "Not tonight, you will not," Mr. Thornton said firmly. "That road is dangerous enough in daylight, and you have already ridden all the way from Tucson today. We will send word first thing in the morning. The girl is safe, and that is what matters." Victoria found herself swept into the warm chaos of the Thornton household. There were 2 daughters, both younger than Victoria, who stared at her muddy appearance with wide eyes until their mother shooed them off to prepare a bath. Within minutes, Victoria was in a small room off the kitchen, standing in a copper tub while buckets of warm water were poured over her. Mrs. Thornton helped her wash, clucking over the bruises already forming on Victoria's arms and legs. "You are lucky nothing is broken," she said. "Those wagon accidents can kill a person." "If Mr. Quinn had not come along when he did," Victoria said, and found she could not finish the sentence. The reality of her situation was beginning to sink in, and her hands shook as she tried to scrub the mud from her hair. "Let me do that, dear," Mrs. Thornton said gently, taking over. "Sam is a good man, one of the best we have ever had working here. Been with us 3 years now, and never once has he given us a moment's trouble. Honest, hard-working, treats the animals well. You could not have asked for a better person to find you." Victoria felt warmth that had nothing to do with the bathwater. He was very kind. "That is Sam," Mrs. Thornton agreed. "Now, let us get you dry and into some clean clothes. You are about my size, so we should be able to find you something suitable." An hour later, Victoria was dressed in a borrowed nightgown and wrapper, her hair toweled dry and hanging in damp waves down her back. She felt almost human again, though every muscle in her body ached. Mrs. Thornton led her to the kitchen, where a bowl of hot stew and fresh bread were waiting. Samuel was there too, cleaned up and changed into dry clothes. He stood when Victoria entered, and she saw his eyes widen slightly. Self-consciously, she touched her loose hair, knowing she should have braided it, but Mrs. Thornton had insisted she eat first. "You look much recovered, Miss Harrington," Samuel said, and there was something in his voice that made Victoria's cheeks warm. "Thanks to you," she said. "I do not know how I can ever repay your kindness." "No repayment needed," he said firmly. "I am just glad I came along when I did." They sat at the kitchen table, and despite her exhaustion, Victoria found herself drawn into easy conversation. Samuel told her about his work at the ranch, about the cattle drive that was being planned for next month, about the land and the challenges of ranching in the Arizona territory. His voice was deep and pleasant, and he had a way of speaking that made even ordinary things sound interesting. Victoria told him about her journey from St. Louis, about how her father had died the previous year, leaving her mother and her in difficult circumstances. How her mother had passed just 3 months ago from pneumonia, leaving Victoria alone in the world, except for her Aunt Martha, who had written immediately and insisted Victoria come live with her. "It must have been frightening," Samuel said, "making such a journey alone." "It was," Victoria admitted, "but also exciting. I have never been west of the Mississippi before. Everything is so different here, so vast and wild." "It is that," Samuel agreed, "but it is also beautiful in its own way. Wait until you see the desert after a rain, when all the wildflowers bloom, or the mountains at sunset. It is like nothing else in the world." The way he spoke about the land made Victoria want to see all of those things, and more. She realized she wanted to see them with him. The thought startled her so much that she nearly dropped her spoon. Mrs. Thornton, who had been quietly listening from her place by the stove, smiled knowingly. "It is late, and you have both had a long day. Victoria, dear, let me show you to your room. Sam, the bunkhouse is probably dark by now. You can take the spare room tonight." "I do not want to put anyone out," Samuel started to protest, but Mr. Thornton cut him off. "Nonsense. You brought this young lady to safety. The least we can do is give you a proper bed for the night. Besides, you will need to hitch up the wagon at first light to go collect the rest of Miss Harrington's things." Samuel nodded his acceptance, and Victoria found herself oddly reluctant to say goodnight. But exhaustion was pulling at her, making her eyelids heavy, and she let Mrs. Thornton lead her to a small but comfortable bedroom. "Sleep well, dear," the older woman said kindly. "Things always look better in the morning." But as Victoria lay in the narrow bed, listening to the rain on the roof, she found sleep elusive despite her tiredness. Her mind kept returning to Samuel Quinn, to the strength of his arms as he had lifted her from the mud, to the gentleness in his hands, to the way his eyes had warmed when he looked at her across the kitchen table. She barely knew him, she reminded herself. He was a ranch hand, and she was going to be living in town, helping her aunt run the boarding house. Their worlds would likely never intersect again after tomorrow. The thought made her chest ache in a way she did not want to examine too closely. Eventually, she drifted into an uneasy sleep, her dreams full of storm clouds and creek water eyes. Morning came bright and clear, the storm having washed the sky clean. Victoria woke to the sound of roosters and the smell of coffee and bacon. Her body ached even more than it had the night before, and when she looked in the small mirror on the dresser, she saw an impressive bruise blooming on her left cheekbone. Mrs. Thornton had laid out a dress for her, a simple calico, that fit reasonably well. Victoria braided her hair and pinned it up as best she could without all her hairpins, many of which were probably still embedded in the mud on the road. When she entered the kitchen, she found the household already bustling with activity. Mr. Thornton and Samuel were discussing the best way to retrieve her wagon and belongings. The two Thornton daughters were setting the table, sneaking curious glances at Victoria. Samuel looked up when she entered, and his expression shifted to one of concern when he saw the bruise on her face. "How are you feeling this morning?" he asked. "Sore," Victoria admitted, "but much better than I might have been. I am grateful beyond words for your help, and for the Thorntons' hospitality." "Sit down and eat," Mrs. Thornton commanded, placing a full plate in front of Victoria. "You need your strength. Sam and Henry are going to collect your things this morning, and then Sam will take you into town to your aunt's place." "I could not ask him to do more," Victoria protested. "He has already done so much." "It is no trouble," Samuel said, and the sincerity in his voice was unmistakable. "Besides, I need to speak with the wheelwright in town about a repair anyway. 2 birds with 1 stone." After breakfast, Victoria helped Mrs. Thornton with the dishes despite the woman's protests that she was a guest. It felt good to do something useful, to repay in some small way the kindness she had been shown. Through the window, she could see Samuel and Mr. Thornton hitching up a wagon, their movements efficient and practiced. "He is a good man," Mrs. Thornton said quietly, following Victoria's gaze. "Been hurt before, though. Some girl back in Texas broke his heart a few years ago. He came out here to start fresh, and he has been alone ever since. Works hard, keeps to himself mostly. But I have seen the way he looked at you, and I have seen the way you looked at him." Victoria felt her cheeks flame. "I only just met him." "Sometimes that is all it takes," Mrs. Thornton said wisely. "My Henry proposed to me 3 days after we met. That was 25 years ago, and I have not regretted a single day. When you know, you know." Before Victoria could respond, Samuel appeared at the back door. "We are ready to head out whenever you are, Miss Harrington." The ride back to the site of the accident was strange in the bright morning light. The road had dried somewhat, though it was still muddy in places. When they reached the spot where Victoria's wagon lay on its side, she was struck by how much worse it looked in daylight. It was a miracle she had not been seriously hurt. Samuel and Mr. Thornton worked efficiently, loading her remaining belongings onto the ranch wagon. Victoria tried to help, but Samuel kept steering her toward the less heavy items, clearly trying to spare her aching body more strain. She wanted to be annoyed by his protectiveness, but found she could not be. It came from a place of genuine care, not condescension. Her poor wagon was indeed beyond immediate repair. The wheel would need to be completely replaced, and Mr. Thornton thought the axle might need work too. They arranged to have it towed back to the ranch, where it could be stored until repairs could be made. "I will pay for the repairs, of course," Victoria said, "and for the storage. We can discuss all that later," Mr. Thornton said kindly. "For now, let us get you to Martha. She will be beside herself with worry." Samuel drove the wagon, while Victoria sat beside him on the bench seat. Mr. Thornton rode behind on horseback, leading Victoria's mare. The morning sun was warm on Victoria's face, and despite everything, she felt a strange sense of contentment. The desert stretched out around them, vast and beautiful just as Samuel had promised, dotted with cacti and scrub brush, with mountains purple in the distance. "It really is beautiful," she said softly. Samuel glanced at her, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I told you, Arizona gets under your skin if you let it. Have you been here long?" 3 years. Came out from Texas after my father died. My mother had passed when I was young, and there was nothing holding me there anymore. I wanted something different, somewhere I could build a new life. He paused, then added, "I do not regret coming here. Do you think you will stay, or will you move on eventually?" Samuel was quiet for a moment, his hands steady on the reins. "I think that depends," he said finally. "On what?" He turned to look at her fully, and the intensity in his eyes made Victoria's breath catch. "On whether I find a reason to stay." The weight of his words hung in the air between them. Victoria knew she should say something, but her heart was beating so hard she could barely think. Before she could find her voice, Samuel turned his attention back to the road, and the moment passed, though the warmth of it lingered. Casa Grande came into view an hour later, a small town that seemed to shimmer in the desert heat. Adobe buildings lined a main street, and Victoria could see people going about their business, horses tied to hitching posts, a dog sleeping in a patch of shade. It looked like every frontier town she had passed through on her journey, and yet different somehow, because this was going to be her home. Aunt Martha's boarding house was a large 2-story adobe building on the edge of town, with a wide porch and flowers blooming in pots. Before the wagon had even fully stopped, the front door burst open and a tall, angular woman with iron-gray hair rushed out. "Victoria!" she cried, and then Victoria was being pulled into a fierce embrace. "Thank God! I was so worried when you did not arrive yesterday. I was about to send out a search party." "I am sorry, Aunt Martha," Victoria said, breathing in the familiar scent of lavender and lye soap that she remembered from childhood visits. "My wagon overturned in the mud, but Mr. Quinn found me and brought me to the Thorntons' ranch." Aunt Martha pulled back to look at Victoria, her sharp eyes taking in the bruise on her face, the borrowed dress. Then she turned to Samuel, who had climbed down from the wagon and was standing respectfully, hat in hand. "Samuel Quinn," she said, and to Victoria's surprise, her stern expression softened. "I might have known you would be involved in rescuing my niece. You have always been one to help those in need." "She was in a bad situation, madam," Samuel said. "Anyone would have done the same." "But you did it," Aunt Martha said firmly. "And for that, you have my deepest gratitude. Bring her things inside, please, and then you must stay for lunch. I insist." Over the next hour, Victoria's belongings were carried into the boarding house, and she was given a bright, airy room on the second floor with a view of the street. Aunt Martha fussed over her, examining her bruises, bringing her willow bark tea for the pain, and asking 1,000 questions about her journey. Finally, they sat down to lunch in the boarding house dining room. Several boarders were present, including a school teacher, a surveyor, and an elderly gentleman who claimed to be a retired prospector. Aunt Martha introduced Victoria to each of them, and they all expressed sympathy about her accident. Samuel sat beside Victoria, and she was constantly aware of his presence, the way his arm occasionally brushed hers when he reached for something, the deep rumble of his voice when he spoke. She noticed the way Aunt Martha watched them, her eyes shrewd and knowing. After the meal, as Samuel prepared to leave, Aunt Martha pulled Victoria aside. "That young man is taken with you," she said bluntly, "and unless I miss my guess, you feel the same." "Aunt Martha, I only met him yesterday," Victoria protested weakly. "So, your uncle proposed to me on our second meeting, and we had 40 good years together before he passed. Do not let propriety or caution talk you out of something that could be wonderful. Life is too short and too uncertain out here." Samuel was waiting by the wagon, speaking with Mr. Thornton. When Victoria came out, he turned to her, and she saw uncertainty in his eyes for the first time. "I suppose this is goodbye, then," he said, "unless you need anything else." Victoria felt panic flutter in her chest. She could not let him just ride away. "Will you come back?" she blurted out, then felt her face heat at her own boldness. But Samuel's face lit up with a smile that transformed his features. "I would like that very much, if you would not mind." "I would not mind at all. Then I will call on you in a few days, if that is acceptable to your aunt." "It is more than acceptable," Aunt Martha called from the doorway, making both Samuel and Victoria jump. "You are welcome here any time, Samuel Quinn." Samuel left shortly after, and Victoria watched from her window as the wagon rolled out of town. Only when it had disappeared from sight did she turn away, pressing her hand to her chest where her heart was doing strange, fluttery things. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Aunt Martha's boarding house was busy, and Victoria threw herself into helping, learning the routines of cooking for a dozen people, changing linens, keeping the accounts. Her aunt ran a tight ship, but she was fair and kind, and the boarders clearly respected her. Victoria found herself thinking about Samuel constantly. She would be kneading bread dough and remember the strength of his hands. She would be hanging laundry and recall the way his eyes had caught the morning light. At night, lying in her bed, she would replay their conversations, finding meaning in every word. True to his promise, Samuel came to call 3 days later. He arrived in the late afternoon, freshly shaved and wearing clean clothes, his hat in his hands. Victoria, who had been watching for him from the parlor window, felt her heart leap when she saw him tie his horse to the hitching post. Aunt Martha answered the door, and Victoria could hear her inviting Samuel in with genuine warmth. When he entered the parlor where Victoria waited, his face broke into a smile that made her knees weak. "Miss Harrington," he said formally, though his eyes were warm. "It is good to see you looking so well." "Please call me Victoria," she said. "After everything, I think we can dispense with formality." "Victoria," he repeated, and the way he said her name sent shivers down her spine. "Would you like to take a walk? If your aunt approves, of course." They walked through the town, Samuel pointing out various buildings and telling her stories about the people who lived and worked in them. The blacksmith who had won his shop in a poker game, the seamstress who had come west as a mail-order bride only to find her intended had died and had stayed anyway. The bartender who had once been a professor at Harvard. "Everyone here has a story," Samuel said. "That is one of the things I love about the West. You can be whoever you want to be. Your past does not matter as much as who you are now." They ended up at a small park on the edge of town, where a few scraggly trees provided shade. They sat on a bench, and Victoria found herself telling Samuel things she had never told anyone. About her fears when her mother died, about feeling lost and alone, about her hopes for building a new life here. Samuel listened intently, and when she finished, he said, "You are brave, braver than you know. Coming all this way, starting over, that takes real courage." "I did not feel very brave when my wagon tipped over," Victoria said, with a self-deprecating laugh. "You were brave then too," Samuel insisted. "You did not panic. You tried to save your belongings and calm your horse. Many people would have just screamed and given up." His faith in her touched something deep inside Victoria. They talked until the sun began to set, and Samuel reluctantly said he needed to get back to the ranch. They walked slowly back to the boarding house, neither of them wanting the afternoon to end. At the door, Samuel said, "May I call on you again, perhaps on Sunday? I have the afternoon off." "I would like that very much," Victoria said. Samuel reached out and gently touched her hand, just a brief brush of his fingers against hers, but it sent electricity through her entire body. Until Sunday, then. Victoria floated into the house, and Aunt Martha, who was in the kitchen, took one look at her face and laughed. "Oh, you have it bad, my girl." "Is it that obvious?" Victoria asked, mortified. "Only to anyone with eyes, and Samuel is no better. The boy could not stop smiling the entire time he was here. It does my heart good to see it." Sunday came after what felt like the longest 3 days of Victoria's life. She took special care with her appearance, wearing her best dress, one that had survived the wagon accident relatively unscathed. She pinned her hair up carefully, and even dabbed a bit of rose water on her wrists. Samuel arrived exactly on time, and this time he brought flowers, wild flowers that he had clearly picked himself. "They reminded me of you," he said, handing them to her, beautiful and resilient. Victoria felt tears prick her eyes at the simple, heartfelt gesture. She gave the flowers to Aunt Martha to put in water, and then she and Samuel set off on their walk. This time, Samuel led her out of town to a place where the desert opened up into a vista of stunning beauty. They could see for miles, the land stretching out in shades of gold and brown, mountains rising in the distance, the sky impossibly blue overhead. "This is one of my favorite places," Samuel said. "I come here sometimes when I need to think, or when the world feels too heavy." They sat on a large flat rock, and Samuel told her more about his life, about growing up in Texas on a small ranch, about his father, who had taught him everything about horses and cattle, about his mother, who had died from fever when he was 8, about the girl he had loved back home, who had promised to wait for him, but had married someone else while he was away on a cattle drive. I thought my heart would never heal, he admitted. For a long time, I did not want it to. But being here, building something new, it helped. And now, he turned to look at Victoria, and the vulnerability in his eyes made her breath catch. Now, I think maybe my heart was just waiting for the right person. Victoria's hand found his, their fingers intertwining naturally. I think I know what you mean. When my mother died, I felt like I had lost everything. But maybe I had to lose everything to find something better. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching hawks circle overhead, feeling the warm sun on their faces. Then Samuel said, Victoria, I know we have not known each other long, and I know I am just a ranch hand with nothing much to offer, but I cannot stop thinking about you. You are in my thoughts from the moment I wake up until I fall asleep at night. I have never felt this way before, not even with Sarah back in Texas. What I feel for you is deeper, truer. Victoria's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. I feel the same way, she whispered. It frightens me how much I feel, how fast it happened, but it is real. I know it is real. Samuel raised her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. Then let me court you properly. Let me prove to you that this is not just some passing fancy. Let me show you what kind of man I am, what kind of husband I could be. Yes, Victoria said, and the word came out part laugh, part sob. Yes, I want that. Samuel pulled her into his arms, and Victoria let herself sink into his embrace, feeling safe and cherished in a way she had never felt before. They stayed like that for a long time, holding each other as the sun moved across the sky. The next months passed in a blur of happiness. Samuel called on Victoria twice a week, and they spent every possible moment together. He taught her to ride better, taking her out on gentle trails where she grew to love the freedom of moving across the open land. She taught him to dance, practicing in Aunt Martha's parlor while the boarding house guests looked on with indulgent smiles. They talked about everything and nothing. Victoria learned that Samuel loved poetry, but was embarrassed to admit it. Samuel discovered that Victoria had a wicked sense of humor, hidden beneath her proper exterior. They shared dreams and fears, hopes and memories. Every conversation brought them closer, weaving their lives together thread by thread. The town began to think of them as a pair. When people saw Victoria, they asked after Samuel. When Samuel came to town, people commented that he must be there to see his girl. Aunt Martha watched over them with a careful but approving eye, chaperoning when necessary, but giving them space to build their relationship. In August, Samuel asked Victoria to come to the Thornton Ranch for a picnic. It was a Sunday, and the summer heat was fierce, but there was a creek on the property that Samuel promised would provide relief. Aunt Martha agreed, after extracting a promise that they would be back before dark. Samuel picked Victoria up in a small buggy, and they drove out to the ranch. The Thorntons greeted them warmly, and Mrs. Thornton packed them a basket full of food. Then Samuel drove them further into the property, to a spot where cottonwood trees grew along a creek that still had water despite the summer drought. It was beautiful and private, the sound of running water mixing with birdsong. Samuel spread a blanket in the shade, and they ate sandwiches and cold chicken, drank cool lemonade from a jar, and shared slices of Mrs. Thornton's famous apple pie. After they ate, they sat by the creek, Victoria, with her feet dangling in the cool water, her shoes and stockings abandoned on the bank. Samuel sat beside her, his boots off as well, and they watched minnows dart between the rocks. Victoria, Samuel said, and something in his voice made her turn to look at him. These past months with you have been the happiest of my life. Every day I wake up grateful that I happened to be riding down that road the day your wagon tipped over. It feels like fate, like we were meant to find each other. I feel the same way, Victoria said softly. Samuel reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden box. Victoria's heart began to race as he opened it, revealing a simple gold band set with a small but beautiful turquoise stone. This is not much, Samuel said, and she could hear nervousness in his voice for the first time. I have been saving for months, and it is all I could afford. But the turquoise comes from Arizona, from this land that brought us together. Victoria Harrington, I love you with everything I am. Will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life trying to make you as happy as you make me? Tears were streaming down Victoria's face, but she was smiling so hard her cheeks hurt. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Samuel, I will marry you. I love you so much it terrifies me sometimes. You are everything I did not know I was looking for." Samuel's hands shook slightly as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, the turquoise catching the dappled sunlight, filtering through the trees. Then he cupped her face in his hands and kissed her, gentle and sweet, a kiss full of promise and hope. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were grinning like fools. "We should go tell your aunt," Samuel said. "I already asked her permission last week. I wanted to do things properly." Victoria laughed through her tears. "Of course you did. That is exactly like you." They packed up the picnic and drove back to town, holding hands the entire way, stopping occasionally to share another kiss. When they arrived at the boarding house, Aunt Martha took one look at their faces and let out a whoop of joy that brought all the boarders running. "About time," she declared, pulling them both into a hug. "I was beginning to think you two were going to dance around each other forever." That evening, the boarding house threw an impromptu celebration. Someone produced a bottle of good whiskey, another person a fiddle, and soon the parlor was full of music and laughter. Victoria danced with Samuel, with Aunt Martha, with several of the boarders, but her eyes always came back to Samuel, to the ring on her finger, to the future stretching out before them, bright with possibility. They decided to marry in October, after the hottest part of the summer had passed, and before the unpredictable winter weather set in. Victoria and Aunt Martha threw themselves into planning, sewing a dress, arranging for the church, planning the reception. Samuel worked extra hours at the ranch, saving every penny, and began building furniture for the small house they would rent in town. Mr. Thornton pulled Samuel aside one day and offered him a promotion to foreman with a significant raise in pay. "You are the best hand I have ever had," he said, "and you are starting a family. You will need the extra money." Samuel accepted with gratitude that threatened to overwhelm him. Everything was falling into place, as if the universe had decided to bless their union. The wedding day arrived cool and clear, one of those perfect October days that Arizona sometimes gifted. Victoria wore a dress of cream-colored silk that she and Aunt Martha had labored over for weeks, with lace at the collar and cuffs. She wore wildflowers in her hair, the same kind Samuel had brought her on their second outing together. The church was small but packed with people. The Thorntons were there, of course, along with most of the hands from the Double Bar Ranch. All of the boarding house residents attended, as well as what seemed like half the town of Casa Grande. Victoria had not realized how many lives she and Samuel had touched in their short time together. Samuel stood at the altar in a new suit, his hair neatly combed, his face shining with joy and love. When Victoria walked down the aisle on Aunt Martha's arm, his eyes filled with tears, and she had to blink back her own. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. They exchanged vows in steady voices, though both were trembling with emotion. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Samuel kissed Victoria with such tenderness that there was not a dry eye in the church. The reception was held at the boarding house, which Aunt Martha had transformed with ribbons and flowers. There was food and music and dancing that lasted long into the night. Samuel waltzed with his new wife, holding her close, both of them lost in their own world even in the midst of the crowd. "Happy?" Samuel murmured against her hair. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Victoria replied. "Thank you for pulling me out of that mud, Cowboy." Samuel laughed. "Best decision I ever made." They spent their wedding night in the small house Samuel had prepared for them. It was modest, just 3 rooms, but he had made it as comfortable as he could with the furniture he had built and the touches Victoria had added in the weeks before the wedding. There were curtains on the windows, rugs on the floor, and a quilt on the bed that Aunt Martha had given them as a wedding present. Samuel carried Victoria over the threshold, both of them laughing, and then they were alone for the first time as husband and wife. The laughter faded into something deeper, and they came together with a passion tempered by tenderness, learning each other, loving each other, making promises with their bodies that echoed the vows they had spoken earlier. Afterward, lying in bed with Victoria's head on his chest, Samuel said, "I am going to spend every day of the rest of my life making sure you never regret saying yes to me." "I could never regret it," Victoria said, pressing a kiss over his heart. "You saved me, Samuel, not just from the mud that day, but from a life without love, without purpose. You gave me everything." "You gave me everything too," Samuel said. You gave me a reason to wake up in the morning, a reason to build a future. You gave me hope." They fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, and Victoria dreamed of the future they would build together. The first year of marriage brought challenges along with joys. The small house that had seemed cozy became cramped as they accumulated more possessions. Samuel's work as foreman meant long hours and sometimes overnight trips with the cattle. Victoria helped Aunt Martha during the day, but she missed her husband fiercely when he was gone. But every challenge only seemed to strengthen their bond. When Samuel came home exhausted from a week managing a difficult calving season, Victoria would have a hot meal waiting and would massage his sore shoulders. When Victoria came down with a terrible flu that left her bedridden for a week, Samuel took time off work to nurse her, sitting by her bedside, reading to her, bringing her cool water and hot broth. They learned each other's rhythms, their habits and quirks. Samuel discovered that Victoria was grumpy in the mornings until she had her coffee. Victoria learned that Samuel needed quiet time to decompress after a hard day. They learned to communicate, to voice their needs and fears rather than letting them fester. Their first anniversary came and went with a quiet celebration, just the two of them, and a picnic at the creek where Samuel had proposed. They lay on a blanket under the stars, talking about the year that had passed and the future they wanted to build. "I want children," Victoria said softly. "I want to fill our house with laughter and noise and love." "I want that too," Samuel agreed. "I want a son I can teach to ride, a daughter I can spoil. I want to build them the kind of home I always wished I had, full of warmth and security." 3 months later, Victoria realized she was pregnant. She told Samuel one evening after dinner, watching his face carefully for his reaction. For a moment, he just stared at her, and then joy broke across his features like sunrise. "Truly?" he breathed, and when she nodded, he let out a whoop and swept her into his arms, spinning her around until she was dizzy and laughing. The pregnancy was not easy. Victoria suffered from terrible morning sickness in the early months, and as she grew larger, the summer heat became almost unbearable. But Samuel was attentive and devoted, bringing her cool drinks, fanning her when she was too hot, rubbing her swollen feet at the end of long days. Aunt Martha was thrilled about the baby and spent hours knitting blankets and tiny clothes. The boarding house residents all pitched in, one building a beautiful cradle, another sewing a layette, all of them offering advice and well wishes. In June of 1880, after 12 hours of labor attended by the town doctor and Aunt Martha, Victoria gave birth to a healthy baby boy. Samuel, who had been pacing outside the bedroom, nearly broke down the door when he heard the baby's first cry. He looked at his son with such wonder and love that Victoria felt her heart might burst. "He is perfect," Samuel whispered, gently touching the baby's tiny hand. "He is absolutely perfect." They named him James, after Samuel's father, with the middle name Thomas after Victoria's father. Little Jamie, as they quickly began calling him, had his father's dark hair and his mother's gray eyes. He was a content baby, quick to smile, and he wrapped both his parents around his tiny finger from day one. Life settled into a new rhythm with a baby in the house. Samuel would wake early to tend to Jamie, so Victoria could sleep a bit longer. Victoria would bring Jamie to the ranch sometimes, and Samuel would show him the horses and cattle, talking to him about the work, even though Jamie was far too young to understand. When Jamie was 6 months old, Mr. Thornton approached Samuel with an offer. "I am getting older," he said, "and my daughters have no interest in ranching. I want to start selling off portions of the double bar to my most trusted workers, people who will care for the land and keep the spirit of the place alive. I would like to sell you 50 acres, Samuel, at a price you can afford. You can build a house for your family, run some cattle of your own while still working as foreman." Samuel was stunned. It was more than he had ever dreamed of, a chance to own land, to build something permanent for his family. He discussed it with Victoria that night, and her eyes shone with excitement. "It is everything we have been working toward," she said. "Our own land, our own home. Let us do it, Samuel." They spent the next 2 years saving every penny and planning their house. Samuel worked on it in his spare time, and many of the ranch hands helped, turning it into a community project. Slowly, the house took shape on a beautiful piece of land, with a view of the mountains and a creek running through it. It was a simple but solid house, built to withstand the harsh Arizona weather. There was a large kitchen where Victoria could cook and bake, a parlor with a fireplace for the cold winter nights, and 3 bedrooms because they both wanted more children. There was a wide porch where they could sit in the evenings and watch the sunset. They moved in during the spring of 1882, when Jamie was almost 2 years old. Victoria cried happy tears as she walked through their new home, touching the walls that Samuel had built with his own hands, looking out the windows at land that belonged to them. "Thank you," she said to Samuel that night as they stood on the porch watching the stars come out. "Thank you for building this dream for us." "It is our dream," Samuel corrected, putting his arm around her. "Everything I do for us, for our family." 2 months later, Victoria discovered she was pregnant again. This pregnancy was easier than the first, and in January of 1883 she gave birth to a daughter. They named her Margaret Rose, and she was tiny and delicate with wisps of blonde hair and eyes that would eventually turn the same creek water color as her father's. Samuel was utterly besotted with his daughter. He would carry her for hours, singing to her in his deep voice, telling her stories about the ranch and the land. Jamie, now 2.5, was fascinated by his baby sister and wanted to help with everything, bringing diapers and blankets, patting her gently on the head. The years flowed by, each one bringing new joys and challenges. They added more cattle to their small herd. Samuel's reputation as a skilled rancher grew, and people began coming to him for advice. Victoria started a small garden, and her vegetables became prized at the local market. They were building a life, piece by piece, day by day. Jamie grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved the horses and wanted to be just like his father. Maggie was spirited and adventurous, constantly getting into mischief and charming her way out of trouble. In 1885, another son arrived, whom they named Henry after Mr. Thornton. Little Henry was the quietest of their children, content to sit and observe, but with a smile that could light up a room. The years had weathered Samuel and Victoria, adding lines to their faces and silver to their hair, but they had only grown more beautiful to each other. They knew each other so well now that they could communicate with just a look. They had weathered hardships together, a drought that nearly broke them financially, illnesses that scared them, the normal struggles of raising a family, and each trial had only made their bond stronger. One evening in the fall of 1890, after the children were in bed, Victoria and Samuel sat on their porch as they did most evenings. Jamie was 12 now, and showing real promise as a horseman. Maggie was 7 and already reading everything she could get her hands on, dreaming of becoming a teacher. Henry was 5 and obsessed with building things, spending hours with scraps of wood and nails. "Do you ever think about that day?" Victoria asked suddenly. "The day my wagon tipped over?" Samuel smiled, reaching for her hand. "All the time. I think about how close I came to taking a different road that day, how easily I might have missed you entirely. It terrifies me sometimes, how much of life comes down to chance." "It was not chance," Victoria said firmly. "It was fate. We were meant to find each other, Samuel. I believe that with everything I am." "I believe it too," he agreed. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Victoria Quinn. Every morning I wake up next to you, I feel like the luckiest man alive." "Even when I am grumpy before my coffee?" Victoria teased. "Especially then," Samuel said, and they both laughed. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of their land, the distant sound of cattle lowing, an owl hooting from the cottonwoods by the creek. The sky was vast and full of stars, and the air smelled of sage and dust and home. "I am proud of us," Victoria said softly, "of what we have built together. This land, this family, this life. It is more than I ever dreamed of when I left St. Louis all those years ago." "We have been blessed," Samuel agreed. "But we also worked hard for this. We chose each other every day through good times and bad. That is what makes it special." As if on cue, they heard a thump from inside the house, followed by whispered giggling. Samuel sighed. "Maggie is out of bed again." "Let me go," Victoria said, standing. "You have been up since before dawn." But Samuel stood too. "Let us both go. I want to tuck her in." They went inside together, finding Maggie in the hallway, trying to sneak into Jamie's room. When she saw her parents, she gave them her most winning smile. "I was just going to ask Jamie about his book," she said innocently. "You were supposed to be asleep an hour ago, young lady," Victoria said, but she was fighting a smile. Samuel scooped Maggie up into his arms. "Come on, Trouble, back to bed." He carried her to her room and tucked her into bed, while Victoria lit the lamp and sat on the edge of the mattress. Maggie looked up at them with her father's eyes, and Victoria was struck by how fast time was moving, how quickly her babies were growing up. "Tell me the story," Maggie demanded, "about how you and Papa met." It was a story they had told many times, but the children never tired of hearing it. Samuel and Victoria exchanged a look, and then Samuel began. "It was a dark and stormy day," he said in his storytelling voice, making Maggie giggle. "And your mama's wagon had tipped over in the mud." "And you saved her," Maggie prompted. "I pulled her out of the mud," Samuel agreed, "and she was covered head to toe in it, looking like some kind of swamp creature." "I did not," Victoria protested, as she always did. "But even covered in mud, she was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen," Samuel continued, his eyes finding Victoria's. "And I knew, right then and there, that my life had just changed forever." "What did you think, Mama?" Maggie asked. Victoria smoothed her daughter's hair back from her forehead. "I thought your father was the kindest, bravest man I had ever met, and I was right." "And then you fell in love and got married and had us," Maggie said happily. "That is right," Samuel said. "And we lived happily ever after." "But this is not ever after," Maggie pointed out with the logic of a 7-year-old. "This is now." Samuel laughed. "You are right. I suppose happily ever after is not a moment. It is all the moments, strung together like beads on a string. Every day we choose to love each other, to be kind to each other, to build this life together. That is our happily ever after." Maggie thought about this for a moment, then nodded, satisfied. "I want a happily ever after like yours when I grow up." "I hope you get one," Victoria said, leaning down to kiss her daughter's forehead. "Now sleep, my darling." They left Maggie's room and checked on the boys. Jamie was already asleep, his book fallen from his hand. Henry was curled up with his favorite wooden horse. Victoria and Samuel stood in the doorway, looking at their children, feeling the weight of their love and responsibility. Back in their own room, as they got ready for bed, Victoria said, "I cannot believe how lucky we are." "Luck had nothing to do with it," Samuel said, echoing her words from earlier. He came to stand behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, meeting her eyes in the mirror. "We built this together, every choice, every sacrifice, every moment of joy and pain. This is ours, Victoria." She turned in his arms and kissed him, a kiss that still held all the passion and promise of their first kiss all those years ago. "I love you, Samuel Quinn. I will love you until my last breath and beyond." "And I love you," he said against her lips. "My beautiful, brave, wonderful wife. Thank you for saying yes to me all those years ago." "Thank you for offering your hand," Victoria replied, "for pulling me out of the mud and into this beautiful life." They climbed into bed, and Samuel pulled Victoria close, her head resting on his chest as it had on their wedding night and countless nights since. Outside, the wind whispered through the cottonwoods, and somewhere, an animal called to its mate. Inside, all was warm and safe and full of love. As Victoria drifted off to sleep, she thought about the journey that had brought her here, the loss of her parents, the long trip west, the terrifying moment when her wagon had tipped over. If someone had told her then what her life would become, she would not have believed them. But fate, or chance, or divine providence had put Samuel Quinn on that muddy road at exactly the right moment, and everything had changed. She had come west looking for a home, and she had found so much more. She had found love, partnership, purpose. She had found a man who saw her, really saw her, and loved everything he saw. She had found a place where she belonged, land that felt like it had been waiting for her, a future bright with possibility. The years continued to pass, each one adding to the tapestry of their life. Jamie grew into a fine young man, eventually taking over more and more of the ranch work as Samuel's hair turned fully silver. At 19, Jamie married a sweet girl from town, and they built a house on another portion of the Quinn land. Samuel and Victoria became grandparents, and nothing in their lives had prepared them for the fierce love they felt for their grandchildren. Maggie did become a teacher, fulfilling her childhood dream. She taught in the Casa Grande schoolhouse and became known for her patience and creativity. She married at 22, a banker's son who moved west for adventure and found love instead. They gave Samuel and Victoria 3 more grandchildren to spoil. Henry took after his father in his love for building things. He became a skilled carpenter and then an architect, designing homes and buildings all over Arizona. He married later than his siblings, at 28, to a widow with 2 children of her own, and he loved those children as if they were his blood. Aunt Martha lived to see all of Victoria's children grown and married. She passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 82, surrounded by the family she had helped to build. Victoria mourned her deeply, but was grateful for all the years they had together, for the wisdom and love Aunt Martha had shared so freely. The Thorntons eventually retired and moved to California to be near Mrs. Thornton's sister, but not before throwing a huge celebration for all the ranch hands who had become like family over the years. Samuel and Victoria attended, and it was a bittersweet evening full of memories and tears and laughter. As the new century dawned, Samuel and Victoria found themselves in their 50s, their children grown, their grandchildren numerous. The world was changing rapidly around them. There was talk of automobiles replacing horses, of electricity coming to even small towns like Casa Grande, but on their ranch, life continued much as it always had, following the rhythms of the seasons and the land. They had added to their house over the years, building a larger parlor, adding a room for visiting grandchildren. The furniture Samuel had built with his own hands 30 years earlier was still in use, worn smooth and comfortable with age. The bed where they slept was the same one from their wedding night, though they had replaced the mattress several times. On their 30th wedding anniversary, their children threw them a huge party. It seemed like the whole town turned out to celebrate Samuel and Victoria Quinn, the couple whose love story had become something of a legend in Casa Grande. People who had not even been born when they married knew the story of how Samuel had pulled Victoria from the mud and how that moment had changed both their lives. During the party, Jamie stood up to give a toast. He was 32 now, a father himself, with his father's strong build and his mother's thoughtful eyes. "To my parents," he said, his voice carrying across the crowded room, "you taught us what love looks like. Not the easy romantic love of storybooks, but the real love that shows up every day. The love that works hard, that compromises, that chooses kindness even when it is difficult. You built a life together that has blessed not just your own family, but this entire community. We love you, and we thank you for showing us the way." There was not a dry eye in the house as Samuel and Victoria stood together, his arm around her waist, her head against his shoulder. Both of them moved beyond words by the love and respect in their children's faces. That night, back home in their quiet house, Victoria said, 30 years. How is that possible? It feels like yesterday and a lifetime ago all at once." "Every day with you has been a gift," Samuel said. "Even the hard days, the days when we argued or struggled or barely had 2 pennies to rub together, I would not trade a single moment of it." "Nor would I," Victoria agreed. "You kept your promise, you know, the one you made on our wedding night. You made sure I never regretted saying yes to you." "It was an easy promise to keep," Samuel said, pulling her close. "Loving you has been the easiest, most natural thing I have ever done." They slow danced in their parlor to music only they could hear, moving together with the ease of 3 decades of practice. They had created something rare and precious, a love that had weathered every storm, that had grown stronger with time rather than fading. They had built not just a house and a ranch, but a legacy of love that would carry on through their children and grandchildren and beyond. As the years advanced into the 1900s, Samuel and Victoria began to slow down. Samuel, now in his 60s, handed over most of the daily operations of the ranch to Jamie, though he still spent time with the horses he loved. Victoria spent her days tending her garden, which had become famous in 3 counties, and spoiling her grandchildren, of which there were now 10. They took to spending even more time on their porch in the evenings, watching the sun set over land they had shaped with their own hands. They talked less now, comfortable enough with each other that silence was not awkward but companionable. Sometimes they would sit for an hour without speaking, just holding hands, being together. One evening in the spring of 1908, as they sat watching a spectacular sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, Victoria said, "I have been thinking about that day a lot lately, the day we met." "So have I," Samuel admitted. "I think about how different my life would be if I had not been on that road. If I had left Tucson an hour earlier or later, if I had taken the other route back to the ranch. We would have found each other somehow," Victoria said with certainty. "I truly believe that. Some things are simply meant to be. Samuel brought her hand to his lips and kissed it, a gesture he had made thousands of times over the years, but that never lost its meaning. I offered you my hand that day to pull you out of the mud, and you took it and never let go. And I never will, Victoria promised, not in this life or whatever comes after. They sat in silence for a while longer, watching as stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the house, they could hear their grandchildren playing, visiting for the weekend. The sound of young laughter filled the air, a promise that their love would continue to ripple outward long after they were gone. We did well, Samuel said softly. We took a chance on each other, on love, on building a life in this wild place. And we did well. We did better than well, Victoria corrected. We built something beautiful. We loved each other and raised a family and created a home that people want to come to. That is more than most people ever get. It is more than I ever dreamed of, Samuel agreed. You are more than I ever dreamed of. As the last light faded from the sky and the stars came out in full force, Samuel and Victoria Quinn sat together on their porch, hands clasped, hearts intertwined. Behind them was a life well lived, full of love and laughter, hard work and hard-won joys. Ahead of them were more years together, growing old side by side, watching their family grow and flourish. They had started with a moment in the mud, a chance encounter on a lonely road, but from that moment, they had built a forever. They had taken the hand that was offered and had held on tight through everything life threw at them. And in doing so, they had created not just a love story, but a testament to the power of choosing love, every single day, no matter what. As they finally rose to go inside, Samuel paused and pulled Victoria into his arms one more time. Under the vast Arizona sky, on the land they had made their own, he kissed his wife with all the passion and tenderness of a young man who had just pulled a beautiful woman from the mud and fallen instantly, irrevocably in love. Forever, he whispered against her lips. Forever, Victoria echoed. And they walked inside together, hand in hand, just as they had walked through life for 30 years and would continue to walk through whatever years remained, partners in all things. Two souls made one by love and choice, and the unbreakable bond they had forged together. The story of Samuel and Victoria Quinn became the kind of tale that was told and retold in Casa Grande for generations. Young couples would point to them as proof that true love existed, that fairy tales could come true even in the harsh realities of frontier life. Their children and grandchildren would carry forward the lessons they had learned from watching Samuel and Victoria love each other through decades of life's ups and downs. Years later, when they were both in their 70s and Samuel's health was beginning to fail, Victoria never left his side. She held his hand through the pain, read to him from his favorite books of poetry, reminded him of all the beautiful moments they had shared. And when he looked at her with those creekwater eyes that had never stopped seeing her as beautiful, she knew that their love had transcended time and age and circumstance. On a quiet morning in the spring of 1918, Samuel Quinn passed away peacefully in his sleep, his wife's hand in his, surrounded by the family they had created together. Victoria mourned him deeply, but she did not regret a single moment of their 40 years together. She lived another 7 years, spending her time with her children and grandchildren, tending her garden, and sitting on the porch in the evenings, talking to Samuel as if he were still beside her. When Victoria herself passed in 1925, at the age of 78, the entire town turned out for her funeral. They buried her next to Samuel on their land, under the cottonwood trees by the creek, the place where he had proposed so many decades ago. Their graves were marked with simple stones that bore their names, and a single inscription chosen by their children, "Forever Together." And so, the love story that had begun with a wagon tipping over in the mud came to its earthly close. But the legacy of Samuel and Victoria Quinn lived on in their children, their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren. It lived on in the ranch they had built, in the community they had helped shape, in the lives they had touched with their kindness and their example. Their story became the kind that people told when they wanted to believe in love, when they needed to remember that even in a harsh and unforgiving world, beauty and connection and forever devotion were possible. It was a story about taking chances, about offering your hand to someone in need, about building something lasting from a single moment of kindness. Most of all, it was a story about love, real and true and lasting. The kind of love that transforms two separate lives into one shared journey, that turns a chance encounter into a lifetime of devotion, that proves that sometimes, when you pull someone out of the mud and offer them your hand, you are really offering them forever. And when they take it, when they hold on and never let go, that is when the real magic begins.